โปรเจกต์ที่คุณสเตเฟนจะขึ้นมาให้โชว์ในวันนี้นะครับก็จะเป็นงานเป็นเราจะเห็นเป็นงานออกแบบละจะเห็นเป็นลักษณะทางกายภาพของตัวสถาปัตยกรรมที่ตอบรับนโยบายเหล่านั้นนะครับในเมืองนะครับซึ่งก็จะเกี่ยวข้องกับในแง่ของพฤติกรรมการใช้แล้วก็เกี่ยวข้องกับการเตรียมพร้อมนะครับสำหรับการเปลี่ยนแปลงโดยเฉพาะสิ่งที่เกิดขึ้นในสิงคโปร์ปัจจุบันนะครับ Please welcome Mr.Stephen Pimbley.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great privilege to be here in Bangkok, especially to talk to you about a subject matter, as Danielle has just been explaining, is very important to every one of us. It's also important because it's influenced quite a lot the way that my practice in Singapore thinks about making its work. And as being a sort of baby boomer born in the late 1950s, sort of post-war, you know, it's important that my generation actually does have a very different aspiration to my father and mother's generation and to my grandmother's generation in how we expect to be treated as we get older. And would hope that's with a great deal more respect than perhaps my grandmother was treated. I'll explain what I mean a little bit later on. But I'm here basically to talk to you about this project called Home Farm. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of background about our business and the way that we think about making the types of projects that we build. It may start off as being a little bit boastful, but last year we were placed on an American company called the Fast List in China as being one of the most innovative companies in China and the only architectural and design practice being on that list. I think innovation in our business is very difficult because a lot of the people that we work for, developers and such like, don't like too much innovation. They like to build things that they know and they understand and they think they can sell. And I suppose that's another reason why I really like coming to Bangkok, because creativity in this city, in this country, is held with great respect. But innovation, of course, is very important to the way that we think about making our work. And we try to bring that into the sort of design process and the output. So it was a very great privilege for us to be put on that list. So some of the projects that we're best known for, quite quickly, this is Clarke Quay in Singapore, a building that we designed. Well, not really a building. In fact, it's not really urban design. It's sort of a mixture of landscape architecture, product design, and urban design in one place. Some of you may know this project, but it's been terribly successful. And it's a great part of the sort of tourism infrastructure in Singapore that people like going to. And people like going to places that we design. And that, again, is a quite interesting factor that we'll come back to in a moment. This is in Kuala Lumpur. It's a commercial project. It's a shop. Basically part of a series of shops for the Louis Vuitton brand. And then in Beijing, we've designed mixed-use projects. Mixed-use, I suppose, is the most prevalent typology in Asia, where you have housing, hotels, businesses, and other facilities like retail all combining in one place. And we design a lot of these types of projects. And in Shanghai, we were lucky enough to be commissioned to design the International Cruise Terminal, probably the longest project we've ever designed, which is just over 1 kilometre long, but combines offices with shipping and tourism infrastructure. But importantly, I suppose this statement that you can see on the screen behind me, we are what we learn, sounds like a very simplistic statement, but it's the sort of sensibilities that you pick up from when you're quite young to you graduate, you go through high school, and then you start practice. It's these things that sort of influence you, that make you what you are, the sort of lexicon that you have inside your head, that this sort of alphabet that brings together a series of issues and connect together, that sort of informs the design work that we do. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, it's in 1966, and I remember that because it was the year that England won the World Football Cup. But I visited with my mother, her great-aunt Laura, who was very old at that time, but she was suffering from tuberculosis. And she stayed in this hospital in Surrey in South Wales, which is a building, it's a sort of modernist building. I'm sure you know what I mean by modernism. It's sort of buildings from the interbellum period between the First World War and Second World War. And a great tenet of the modern movement was about making people's lives better. And I remember this experience. You know, I was very young. I wasn't interested in architecture. I wasn't so interested in football either. But you walk into this place where the sort of beds were, and it's sort of flooded with daylight, and it was a very white interior. It's quite special. It's almost like going to heaven in a way, I suppose. So my mother's aunt was staying in this place in Surrey. So that's my first experience with sort of healthcare type projects, places where people go to feel better. And then as you get older and you start to learn about architecture, you find projects in Scandinavia by fantastic architects like people like Alvar Aalto, who've designed sanitariums, again for tuberculosis. And you create great buildings, but it's not just about the building, it's the environment that those buildings sit in. So this building in Paimio by Alvar Aalto, it's not just about fantastic architecture, it's about the setting of the architecture and this extraordinary green sort of forest. So it's a connection between the spaces inside, the sort of clinical type spaces, with the outside, trying to again make people feel better and recover from tuberculosis. I think what was interesting about the sort of tuberculosis idea as well is people used to sit outside in the sunshine, sort of sit on the terraces. Sort of they're engaging with the sort of landscape and nature to encourage them to feel better. So it's these things, that's what I mean about the sort of learning process and the set of sensibilities that you collect over your career and life that assist you a little bit. Do you have any beer? Great service, thank you. Go on, buzz off. So, there's a book that was written by somebody called Joseph Heller, I think it was in the 1960s, called Catch-22. Nothing to do with architecture or design, but the sort of idea of Catch-22 sort of faces everybody in their sort of career. You know, we do, as you saw, lots of commercial projects. But I'm not so interested in doing lots of commercial projects. We have this set of sensibilities that I've been talking about that we like to apply to lots of different types of projects. But if you do design lots of commercial projects, or you design airports, or you design hospitals, you tend to only design airports or hospitals or commercial projects. But we like to do other things, so we'd have to try and invent these projects. And once in a while, we're lucky enough to do a very different type of project. And one of these projects that's meant a lot to myself, and when I designed it with me, who's sitting in the audience, is Faifa, or I should say Faifa, try and say it in a Thai accent, which was a project sponsored by the TMB Bank. And it allowed us really to sort of engage with the users of the building in a very nice way, that the building is occupied by young children, underprivileged children in a way. And we came up with the idea of having a workshop with these children where the children basically designed the building in which they were going to study on the weekends or after school. So that process, if you're not an arrogant architect, you can learn a lot through the process and people taking ownership of the buildings that you're helping them design. So it's a very privileged, I think, project to work on. So it's two shop houses connected together to create this sort of learning space for these children. It's inประช, if I've said that properly, just outside the city centre. So it's a fun place that was published by Art4D maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Very nice, small project, but again, it's sort of heartwarming experience to go through, engaging with the public, engaging with the children and their teachers, the people who sort of curate the activities. It sort of made the project something perhaps we didn't really believe at the beginning it could be, but it sort of took on a life of its own and became something quite extraordinary, I think. Great fun thing to do as well. So it's sort of stepping outside the sorts of projects that we do on a daily basis. So the project I'm here to really talk to you about is a project, again, that we started by inventing it, and really inventing it because people aren't going to come to you and say, design this sort of project. Home Farm basically deals with the things that we're here to talk about today, which is aging in Asia. And it started off, I was reading in a magazine, I can't remember where I was going, but it was in sort of the New Yorker magazine or Newsweek magazine, I can't really remember. But it had this sort of headline, and it said that sort of diapers for adults are outselling diapers for children in Japan. And I was quite horrified by this statement. It's quite an ugly sort of statement, and it conjures up sorts of horrible pictures in your head. And after I'd read the magazine and closed it, I thought, you don't need to worry about stuff like this. You know, this is not the stuff you need to deal with on a daily basis. But it stayed with me, this fact. And I decided to try and do something about it. I didn't know what we were going to do, but we decided to try and do something about it. And in conversation with people in my office in Singapore, we came up with this project called Home Farm. And Home Farm has been incredibly well received because I suppose I never get to really meet people like Daniela very often. You know, these extraordinary, intelligent people who are doing all this research about cities and aging in cities. But we sort of sit in our office and dream of the projects that we're doing. And quite by chance, other people are thinking about the same thing. I always thought all these ideas were my own ideas, but of course, other people are having these ideas as well. But it's been very well received. It won an award at the World Architecture Festival last year. And our office has been visited by a number of different sort of business communities and social communities. This is the mayor of a district in Taiwan who came to learn about what we're trying to do for Home Farm. So they're interested in building it in Taiwan. It's been published an awful lot because it's sort of a new architectural typology. But it started off, I suppose, the basis for Home Farm. A little bit, I'll go back to sort of my grandmother. Well, my grandmother was very old and quite ill. My father put her into a sort of a care home, which is very much like this building, this building here, which is a sort of residentialism typology. It's sort of a converted building, a converted sort of big old house in South Wales or elsewhere, where they make space for older people to live in, which are pretty awful actually. But you either have that typology or you have this sort of typology, which is a new building, sort of built to look old, which is designed really for the clinicians rather than the people who are living there. It's almost like a pseudo-hospital. So you have this sort of process-driven language of architecture that's more about the people who are working there, the nurses and the doctors, and not at all about the people who are going there to sort of spend their latter years, which is terribly sad, I think. So Home Farm is really about two things. The science fiction writer Isaac Asimov wrote this essay about creativity. And he said in this essay that people who are very creative are always those who can manage to bring together sort of two what are normally siloed activities, two activities that are poles apart, and bring them together in one place where they've always seemed to be. So it's bringing two things together in a seamless way, and it becomes a very normal type experience. So Home Farm is a little bit like that, and it deals with these two issues of aging that we've been talking about and food. And food, because Singapore, as some of you may know, basically imports 98% plus of everything that's eaten there, very unlike Thailand. So there are sort of issues in Singapore that perhaps other countries in Asia don't need to deal with. So we decided to bring these two topics together in an interesting way. And of course, this image is really about the traditional Asian family, where in places like Singapore, it's dying out because Singaporeans aren't having enough babies. They're not having enough sex. They're not creating the sort of next generation enough, and perhaps they're dying out a little bit. And the government has got great policies about trying to bring people together to create the sort of more families, to create an increase in the birth rate. So unfortunately, this image is decreasing. And it's not just in Singapore, but in Japan, as we've heard, there are huge problems about the birth rate going down and people being isolated because they're left in their old age. So you can see in this diagram as well, I don't really need to explain it to you, but the amount of farmland, the food issue, has decreased quite a lot since the 1970s. You know, when the sort of imperial powers, the British, left Singapore, it was quite an agricultural community, and sort of as the British left and then Singapore retracted itself from the Malaysian Federation, it changed quite a lot. And it changed in the way that it increased its sort of urbanization very rapidly. So the amount of farmland decreased quite a lot. And, you know, Singapore has been an extraordinary financial success story, but it's paid lots of penalties in terms of the way that you have a sort of booming population for a while, decrease in land area, land prices increasing, etc., etc. So you can see the diagram at the top, 25%, 1970s, and it's a fraction now. And if you go to a farm in Singapore, it's like an out-of-body experience. You really don't know where you are. It's like going on holiday. It's quite extraordinary. And then the bottom image here, about the sort of younger people that were in place in the 1970s to support one older family member, has gone down, I can't read that, from about 14 or 15 to about 5 people. So there's a drastic change in that balance of the population. And another diagram that we produced that sort of sets out the ambition, or part of the ambition for Home Farm, about making the sort of older generation feel more secure, giving them some purpose in life, that they're connected to the community rather than isolated from it, and creating sort of an income stream so they feel like they're contributing to that community. All of these things are terribly important. And as sort of healthcare gets a lot better, people are living a lot longer, and they need to be more positively engaged with the community and with society. And then food, again, these two parallel activities connected together. When there's a crisis in food, like bird flu or the Nipah crisis, the cost of these products in Singapore, chicken and pork, sort of escalate quite a lot because the market can't control the price. So this is the sort of typical aged care home. This is the sort of facility that my grandmother ended up, and I certainly don't want to spend my sort of latter years in a place like this. As I said, my aspirations are very different to the aspirations of my grandmother's generation in terms of the way that I want to leave this planet, I suppose. You know, I'd rather spend, you know, my time sort of gardening, perhaps. I'm not a gardener at the moment, but I think this idea about being in the environment, being connected, just like that Alba Alto image, is a very nice way. My grandmother loved gardening, my mother loves gardening, and it's a great way to sort of spend your time. So I think the importance of the Home Farm project as well is about not isolating people from the community that they know, the sort of history that they have, to try and keep them in the community, as I said, not isolated from them, not isolate them from their families as well. And when you go to these care homes, and it's no different whether it's in Thailand, in the UK, or in the United States, you have to travel quite a long way. And that tends to be because care homes are built in areas of the city, especially new ones, where the land is relatively cheap, so they're built on the outskirts, which creates this sort of detachment, which is a big mistake, really, because if you're going to deal with older people, and there are more numerous older people, which means that sort of dementia and Alzheimer's is increasing quite a lot, one method to combat these diseases, which is going to be perhaps the disease of our generation, is to make people more active, make them more cognitive, the cognition sort of activity, and increase it as much as you possibly can. So there are sort of a number of tenets of thought, sort of 4 pillars behind Home Farm. Sustainability, of course, commercial viability, healthcare, and having sort of clinical facilities, engaging with those people as well, and then all these activities coming together to create one building, one new typology, Home Farm. So what's important as well, I think, about aged care facilities is you don't just have older people there. And if you're going to create a new typology, which we have done for Home Farm, that they have sort of a cross-section of society. There are lots of young people there are middle-aged people there, not just old people on their own, to allow these people to feel like they're in a sort of active, proactive community. And then again, at Home Farm, there are lots of different functions. They're not just the functions that support the aging community. There are shops, there are sort of food courts, there are medical centres, there are creche facilities as well, again to create that sort of normal type community in which people who are aged can sort of engage. So this is where the idea of the project started off. And it started off really with an idea of architecture that I'm very fond of. It's sort of a very modernist, almost brutalist type building, a little bit like the project you saw, the sort of 1930s modernism. This is a building by James Sterling that we actually photoshopped over. And it's a college facility in Oxford in the UK. And I like this because it's a courtyard project that sort of captures the space to create this very friendly community space that connects the sort of activities of the building, which is basically student accommodation, together. So you have this community using the courtyard, and then all the people who live around it can look down into that courtyard. And then I thought, well, maybe we can use the face of the building to use new agro technologies to grow vegetables. So that's where the project started off. You see lots of buildings around the world these days that have green facades, but you can't go up to them and pick those facades without fear of being jailed by the people who own the buildings. So this is very much about a facade that grows vegetables commercially to support the activities of the building. So the basic idea of Home Farm is you don't create a ghetto for old people. You don't put them in a tower block that they're not familiar with. You try and create a new typology that's a lot more friendly to the sort of community activities that's trying to support the notion of the project. So no to the tower block, no to the old people's ghetto, and yes to try and create this sort of new idea. So this is a section through the project. The accommodation is arranged over a number of floors that floats above a podium, where there are sort of traditional type farming spaces, and then all those support activities that feed in and support the overall ambition of Home Farm. This is where the shops are, the food courts, and some other gardening spaces. So that's a plan of the ground floor. It's a little bit organic in its nature, but it's organic and permeable at the same time, that people can walk through it. It's open to the public, so you can walk through it. It's connected to the streets around. And these are the shops and the food courts, and all face the inside space. And here's an image of it. I know there have been lots of diagrams, and you've been waiting to see, well, what's he talking about? What's it actually look like? So this is what it looks like. This is the ground floor area with the shops and restaurants and cafes surrounding that inner courtyard. And then the terraces around, where all the accommodation are, where the apartments are covered with this growing facade. And that facade grows things like leafy vegetables that are then either used on the site or sold into local markets. But the idea, it's like a commercial garden, that the value of the product that's being created is pumped back into the building, either in terms of creating salaries for the people who work there. And of course, not everybody wants to work on the farm, but some of those people who live there can earn some income derived from their activities of taking part. And again, the idea and the notion of taking part helps those and stimulate those cognitive functions that we were talking about earlier on, to enable them to engage in activity, engage with the community, engage with the people they're working with. So there's another image taken at a lower level, where you have the shops and the more traditional type farming methods surrounded by this very open and engaged courtyard. And another view, the sort of approach into the main courtyard with the food courts and restaurants and clinics, all feeding into that lower space. And you can see there's a very sort of different language between the lower part of the building, sort of organic structures, and then the buildings that sit above. And that's to create an idea of layering, really. And I suppose where land is scarce, in somewhere like Singapore, you do need to build quite high. But the sort of ground plane of these tower blocks, whether it's in Singapore, whether it's in Bangkok, the public domain, the lower levels of the building need to feel comfortable. They need to feel of a human scale. So it's important you have this sort of strata-like layering of the building to make you feel like you're in a much lower space. So your eye is always focused on what happens here, and not so much what happens above. So this feels very friendly and engaging for those communities. And as I said before, there are lots of activities that take place, picking the plants, sort of the nursery idea about growing the seeds or packaging or really selling that product into the marketplace. And then again, of course, it's aimed at earning money. So the product that's either sold on site in the farm shop or sold locally to supermarkets has a certain price tag, and that money that's earned goes into supporting the people that live there, either with their air conditioning buildings, air conditioning facilities, salaries that they earn, or the clinic bills that they have to pay. And the building has lots of different apartment types, like most developments in Asia, where you can have single people or a couple type apartment that's quite small, maybe 35 square meters, all the way through to 3-generation apartments that give space for older people, their children, and their children's children. So it's this idea of a good cross-section of society and community. It has very good sustainable credentials as well. There is this sort of holistic thinking attached to the growing cycle. You have the plants growing in the aquaponic system that's provided with nutrient-rich water from fish tanks that sit on the roof. That goes back through that system and feeds the plants, and then it goes through a 360-degree cycle. So here you can see it, fish farm. The fish are sold as well into the market. That nutrient-rich water goes into the plants, and then it's taken back to the fish. And the energy cycle is also important as well, that we want to reduce the energy consumption. It's not really possible to make it carbon neutral, but the energy that's consumed in the building is reduced by using something that's called a biomass power station, because the gardening, the farming activities create a huge amount of organic waste. That waste is burnt in the biomass power station that creates sort of hot air, gases, and that gas is turned into electricity. So that electricity provides free air conditioning and free power to all the public facilities of the building. So it reduces the overall energy consumption of the building by maybe 30%. So there it is, quite an interesting idea. So this was the location in Singapore that we chose, quite close to the main hospital, in quite an urban area. And you can see it's open all the way around and connected with the sort of urban grain of the city, which is quite important, because one of the great tenets is about connectivity, not exclusion. So after this had been published quite a lot and quite well received, we're approached approached by a healthcare operator in Malaysia to build Home Farm. Unfortunately, it's not going ahead at the moment. It's on hold because the Malaysian economy is in quite a difficult place. But Home Farm 2 carries the sort of same principles as the initial Home Farm, with the productive garden at its heart and the sort of accommodation arranged around the perimeter. Again, all facing into the sort of garden, so you get this fantastic aspect towards it. And the different layers, these sort of seed-type spaces, feeding and looking into the garden. And I suppose it's worth pointing out that because our client is a healthcare operator, their motivation for the project is a little bit different to a normal developer. I suppose that means that they're interested in other things rather than just earning profit. They're interested in the welfare of the community that's created on the site. And you can see some of the principles of the initial Home Farm carried forward into this project, where you have the garden at the centre and the growing surface wrapping around the podium, and then the tower buildings plugging into that podium. And then again, the same sort of mix of unit typologies that are prevalent in this project. And those combine to create this sort of very convivial type living space. One big difference between Home Farm and this project in Malaysia, Home Farm 2, is that we're using algae, this system here, as a source of energy. So the algae is grown by passing the nutrient-rich water from the fish farm through clear plastic tubes to grow the algae with daylight, and then the algae is dried and used as a source of material, combustible material, to drive the sort of biomass power station. So that'll be a first in Asia if it happens. And some images of the project towards the courtyard and garden spaces. And then from the sort of hospital facilities that again look into that courtyard. And the last project I'm going to show you again came out of the publication of Home Farm. It's called Garden Rooms. It's a very sort of modest project. It's in Glasgow. It's just outside Glasgow in the United Kingdom. And it's a client who owns a lot of these traditional care homes, like the photograph I showed you at the beginning of this talk. The sort of two traditional old houses that have been converted into care facilities. And they asked, whoops, let me go back. These are the two houses here. And they asked us to sort of apply the Home Farm technology of growing onto those facades. So I didn't really want to do that because the buildings are quite ugly. And I didn't think we could sort of rescue the sort of aesthetic of those buildings by putting the aquaponics systems on the facade. So we came up with a slightly different idea about putting in the garden here, which is very nice gardens. They have a very different idea. And it's basically driven by something that I talked about earlier on, which is the increase in dementia. You can see we're around about here somewhere. But by 2050, the number of people, because of the aging, increase in aging and the quality of healthcare, is enabling people to live longer. There's sort of great disease, people believe. I'm not sure whether this information is 100% accurate, but the number of people that will exist in 2050 by dementia will almost be equivalent to those people who don't have dementia, which is a very scary fact indeed. So everything that we can do to increase stimulation, increase the sort of cognitive functions as the brain sort of starts to disintegrate is very important. So one of the ideas behind the Garden Rooms project is to assist in making people active and engage within the community. So those principles that we use quite clearly for the Home Farm projects. This project in Scotland was inspired quite a lot by this Neolithic community which exists on the Orkney Islands just off Scotland. It's called Skara Brae. And I like it because it's a series of sort of very insular environments that are protected from the sort of extreme elements in the sort of the north of Scotland. You get a lot of wind coming off the sea and rain, and it's quite cold. But these places where people used to live and spend their time are in these very protected berms surrounded by landscaping. So that's a plan of Skara Brae. You can see these sort of domestic type spaces. They're very nice and interconnected, but sort of protect the inhabitants, as I said, from the sort of extreme elements. So we used that in the project that we designed to quite good effect, I think. So here's the sort of original sketch that I produced, using sort of local references, Scottish thatch and stone, and the sort of spaces of Skara Brae to create a plan like this. As I said, it's very modest in its scale. And basically, it's a series of small greenhouses that are used for the propagation of vegetables, and the vegetables will support in a very organic way the sort of activities of the care home. So this is the plan. You have the greenhouse where all the growing takes place, the planting and the seeding, and then the more public, the more convivial spaces that surround it, the water pond that creates the nutrient-rich water, and places for people to sit and talk when the weather's a lot nicer, and then the growing substrate that exists all the way around that, protecting the environment a little bit like those sort of Neolithic spaces of Skara Brae. Some elevations of the building. You can see the sort of growing around, there's the greenhouse facilities, clad with these big straw cladding. And then the spaces in and around, the sort of sitting area and the pond area, all very nice spaces for people to sit and relax and become part of the community and undertake activities, as I said, that sort of help with the issues of dementia and Alzheimer's. You know, this is where I want to be when I'm sort of 80, sort of fiddling away. So, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.